Mason is a 10-year-old boy living with his mother, Emma, in a small house on the outskirts of the city. After the death of his father, Mason's family seems to have found peace in their small daily routines, from having breakfast together to quiet afternoons with only the sound of the wind rustling through the branches outside. Everything, though simple, feels complete and warm, making Mason feel that this is the only safe place, the only place where he can find shelter and unconditional love from his mother. Emma is a strong, resilient woman. She has raised Mason on her own for the past 2 years, ever since her husband passed away in an accident. Emma is not only a mother, but also a close friend, always listening to and sharing everything with Mason. Although life isn't rich, the love they share fills all the gaps left by material lack. The two live simply but never without joy. Each day, they work, study, and then relax together in the evenings, sharing small stories or just watching a movie they both love. However, everything begins to change one autumn morning when Mason wakes up. As usual, Emma has prepared breakfast, but today there's something different. Mason senses a shift in the atmosphere, though he can't quite explain what it is. His mother, dressed in office attire, seems busier than usual, but her face is full of excitement. She is preparing for an important meeting. Mason quietly watches, his eyes briefly passing over an old family photo on the dining table. Looking at the picture, Mason feels the absence of his father and wonders if his mother's life will change once again. At that moment, a luxury car pulls up right in front of their house. Mason looks out the window, his curious eyes drawn to the shiny black car. It's not the first time someone has come to visit, but today feels different. A well-dressed man steps out of the car. He is tall, impeccably dressed, with fair skin and slick black hair. He walks into the house without knocking, as if he is already familiar with the place. Emma hurriedly opens the door to greet him. Her smile shines like the first rays of spring sunlight. This man, Thomas, is someone Emma has been planning to meet for a long time. Mason realizes this immediately, even though he has never heard his mother mention him before. Thomas, with his warm voice and calm manner, makes Emma laugh more than usual. Mason feels a strange shift in the air, a feeling he can't quite describe. It's a mix of jealousy and suspicion. Though Mason wants to ask his mother about this man, he just stands quietly in the living room, hearing the laughter and conversation coming from outside. He feels a change in the atmosphere, as if someone has entered and taken up part of the peaceful world he had created. In the following evenings, Emma and Thomas start appearing together more often. They take walks, share dinners, and talk. Mason notices the change in his mother, but can't pinpoint the reason. Emma becomes happier, but sometimes there's a trace of worry in her eyes when she looks at Thomas. As for Mason, he begins to feel a distance growing between him and his mother. The old conversations they used to share aren't happening as much anymore. He starts to feel like an outsider in his own family. A week later, Emma tells Mason that Thomas will visit again. Mason is confused but doesn't dare to object. His sense of worry continues to grow. He doesn't understand why, but there's something about Thomas that unsettles him. He can't quite name it, but he knows that Thomas isn't like the other men his mother has met before. The next day, when Thomas arrives, Emma introduces him to Mason happily. This is Thomas Mason. He's a friend I've met recently. But instead of smiling and greeting him as usual, Mason just lowers his head, quietly observing the man in front of him. He feels that something is wrong, though he can't quite put his finger on it. Thomas's appearance has changed the peaceful life of Mason and Emma. Everything from breakfast to simple evenings now feels different. Mason can't find joy in the old routines. He feels like he's caught in a change he can't control, unsure of what will happen next after the unexpected arrival of this man. Mason had never felt this strange before. He had lived in this house for the past 10 years, and each day passed quietly, with few changes. But ever since Thomas entered his mother's life, everything seemed to be turned upside down. Mason couldn't explain why, but there was something about this man that made him uneasy. Thomas arrived like a storm, taking over everything in the family. At first, Mason tried to adapt to the change. He didn't mind that his mother had found a new companion, but with each passing day, he felt the distance between him and his mother growing. Mason could clearly see that Emma was changing. She was no longer the mother he knew, no longer the strong woman who had faced all the hardships to raise him. She no longer smiled as before, no longer took his hand in the afternoons for walks and shared stories of life, and certainly no longer had those cozy dinners with talks about their day. Emma now seemed to live in a world of her own, with Thomas as the center, her only concern. As for Thomas, even though he still tried to be friendly with Mason, Mason couldn't feel sincerity in his gestures. He was always trying to put on a polite smile, speaking sweet words, but something in his eyes and voice made Mason feel like everything was fake. Mason had never spoken to his mother about how he felt, because he knew Emma would never believe him, or perhaps he was just overreacting. But he couldn't do anything. He could only remain silent and observe. One afternoon, after returning from school, Mason felt something strange when he entered the house. Emma wasn't home, and only Thomas was sitting on the sofa, reading a newspaper. When Mason entered the room, Thomas quickly stood up, smiled, and said, "Hello, Mason. Did you have a good day?" Mason just nodded without replying. The feeling inside him at that moment was like a wave crashing on the shore, unable to calm down. Mason quickly turned and hurried up the stairs. As he stood on the stair landing, he heard Thomas's voice coming from downstairs, strange and somewhat unsettling. "Emma can't know about this. We need to prepare everything carefully," Thomas said, but Mason couldn't hear more as he hurried to his room. Those words echoed in Mason's mind like a warning, a signal he couldn't ignore. Thomas was the new person, the one his mother loved, but why were there conversations Mason couldn't understand? The unease grew stronger as Mason noticed more changes in Thomas's behavior. In the following days, Mason noticed that Thomas was rarely leaving Emma's house. Each time he came, there were long phone calls and secret meetings that Mason couldn't participate in. Sometimes, Mason happened to see Thomas leaving the house in the evening, getting into a luxury car and driving off alone, not saying a word to Emma. Mason watched the car disappear into the night, wondering where he was going and what he was doing. Not only that, but strange signs also appeared in Thomas's actions toward Emma. Every time Emma was busy with work, Thomas would show up, gently intervening in her decisions, but always very determined. One day, Mason overheard a conversation between Emma and Thomas in the living room. Emma seemed to want to go on a short vacation with Mason, but Thomas immediately opposed. "You should stay home and handle things. Everything will be fine. I'll arrange everything for you." Thomas's words made Mason feel a sense of instability rise within him. His mother had listened to him. Mason stood behind the door, looking in, and felt like there was a huge gap between him and his mother. Emma had begun to change in ways that Mason couldn't control. The odd signs continued to appear. One evening, Mason returned after playing with his friends, and when he entered the living room, he felt a strange atmosphere. Both Thomas and Emma were sitting close together on the sofa, but Emma's eyes were not as bright as usual. She didn't smile, wasn't cheerful. Especially when Thomas placed his hand on her shoulder, Mason felt something was wrong. This was not the love he had seen between his mother and father before. It was restraint, suppression, as if they were playing a game Mason wasn't allowed to participate in. The boy quickly went upstairs, but from then on, he felt the distance and tension in the air more clearly. At the same time, Mason noticed changes in his mother's attitude. Emma became less interested in things she used to care about, like asking how Mason was doing at school or sharing evening stories about life. Now, those questions became fewer, and when Mason tried to share a small story from school, Emma just gave a forced smile and told him to rest early. But what worried Mason the most was when he found a strange piece of paper in his mother's bag. It was a large payment receipt with an amount Mason had never seen before. The receipt didn't specify the purpose, only a series of numbers and an address, along with Thomas's name. Mason tried to ask his mother about it, but Emma just brushed it off, saying it was business related and nothing to worry about. But Mason knew he couldn't let this continue. This feeling couldn't deceive him forever. Finally, Mason decided to follow Thomas one day. He secretly went outside after Thomas visited, keeping a distance and following him. And what Mason discovered made him shudder. Thomas went into an unnamed building one late afternoon. After entering, he stayed for a while before coming out with a look of scheming on his face. Mason couldn't just stand by and wait to see how things would unfold. The tension in his heart had reached its peak, and Mason knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to find a way to tell his mother about everything that was happening, even though it might be something she didn't want to hear. Mason could never forget that morning, when everything seemed to culminate into a bright flash, just waiting for him to open his eyes and see the truth. The feeling of anxiety in his heart was no longer vague doubts. Now, it had become a clear fear, so intense that Mason could no longer ignore it. On that day, his mother, Emma, had an appointment with Thomas, as usual. Mason didn't know exactly where they were going, but he knew that once again, the house would become silent, and he would have to face the bottled-up thoughts in his mind. The boy quietly entered his room and looked out the window, seeing Thomas's car stop in front of the house, then watching him walk inside with a thick file in hand. Emma was ready, looking quite happy, but there was also a hint of worry in her eyes. Thomas said something to Emma, and then they quickly left, leaving Mason standing alone in the quiet house. The sense of unease arose more strongly than ever before. Mason could no longer sit still. He had to know the truth. He had to figure out why everything was changing, why his mother was changing, and why Thomas had appeared in their lives. He decided to do something he had never dared do before: follow Thomas. This feeling, one could say, was the feeling of someone doing something against their will, but Mason knew he couldn't just stand by and wait for something to happen. Mason waited until Emma and Thomas's car disappeared from sight, then rushed out of the house, determined to find out where Thomas had gone. He ran a short distance, then walked through the streets, not intending to return until he had uncovered the secret Thomas was hiding. He stopped when he saw Thomas's luxury car parked near an old, discreet-looking building. A faint sign appeared on the glass door: Financial Consulting Company. Mason stood at a distance from the building, trying to observe without letting anyone see him. He watched as Thomas entered the building, alone. From his position, Mason couldn't tell what was inside, but he could sense that something was not right. The tension inside him grew, but Mason was determined not to give up. He turned around and decided to find out more about this building. The next day, Mason continued to observe, but this time, instead of just standing outside, he snuck into the neighborhood, trying to gather information about the building Thomas had entered. After asking around a few times, he learned that it was a well-known financial consulting company, but very few people knew about the activities inside. This made Mason even more suspicious about Thomas's true intentions. In the following days, Mason continued to follow Thomas, and he discovered something he never expected. One evening, when Mason returned home, he happened to see Thomas on a video call with someone. Mason couldn't hear all the words, but what he could hear were pieces of advice Mason couldn't fully understand. We need to keep everything under wraps until she signs the contract. Make sure nothing leaks out. This statement made Mason unable to sit still any longer. His mother, Emma, might be being deceived without even realizing it. The unease became unbearable. Mason decided he had to tell his mother, though he knew it would be difficult. He couldn't continue living in worry and fear. He had to face the truth. He began looking for opportunities to talk to his mother. Anytime, anywhere, Mason only wanted to share everything he had heard and seen. One evening, after everyone had eaten and Thomas had left, Mason decided not to wait any longer. He walked into the living room, where his mother was sitting reading a book. Mason took a deep breath, then walked over to her. "Mom," Mason said, his voice slightly trembling. Emma looked up and smiled at him. "What's wrong, dear?" Emma asked. "I need to talk to you." Mason started, but then he fell silent, unable to continue. Everything he had seen, everything he had heard, seemed to be building up inside, preventing him from speaking. But he couldn't stay silent anymore. He couldn't let his mother continue being deceived. "I don't think Thomas is who you think he is. I've heard his calls, the things he says about you, about us," Mason said, looking straight into his mother's eyes. "Can't you see that?" Emma looked at him, her eyes confused. "Mason, what are you talking about? Thomas loves me. He loves you too. You're just worried too much." But Mason couldn't stop. He continued to tell Emma everything he had witnessed, the calls and conversations between Thomas and strangers. Every word he spoke seemed to wound Emma deeply. She didn't know how to react, just standing there, silent, as if she couldn't believe what Mason had just said. His mother didn't believe him, and Mason felt a heart-wrenching pain. Mason knew he had to do something to save his mother, but would Emma trust him enough? That question echoed in Mason's mind like an open wound. Mason could never forget the moment when he stood in front of his mother and revealed everything he suspected about Thomas. Since then, everything in his family seemed to fall apart. Emma, the mother Mason loved most, now looked at him with eyes full of worry and doubt. "Sweetie, Thomas is a good man. You can't say that about him," Emma said when the boy opened up to share everything he had witnessed. Those words kept echoing in Mason's head, but they did nothing to ease his confusion. He couldn't accept that his mother was defending the man he could not trust. Mason felt lost in his own home. Everything he thought and felt now seemed meaningless in his mother's eyes. Emma could not believe the words her son was saying. That feeling hit him hard, making Mason stunned and fearful. Could it be that everything he sensed was wrong? Could the clear signs be insufficient to prove that Thomas had ill intentions? He could not bear the coldness in his mother's eyes whenever Thomas appeared. Each time they met, Mason felt as if an invisible wall had risen between him and Emma. In the days that followed, Mason no longer dared to speak with his mother. The boy became quieter, retreating into his own world. Every time Emma and Thomas went out, Mason found himself increasingly pushed out of the family world he had once considered the safest place. Despite his attempts to make his mother see the truth, Emma continued to trust the man. The feeling of hopelessness grew stronger in Mason, as if everything he did was in vain. What could he do when his own mother didn't believe what he said? One night, when Emma and Thomas went out for dinner together, Mason sat in the living room holding a book but unable to focus on reading. His mind was swirling with countless unanswered questions. Then the doorbell rang. He stood up, went to answer the door, and saw a scene he never expected. A strange man, around 40 years old, stood outside with a large briefcase. Mason didn't recognize him, but the man's expression felt strangely familiar. A sense of unease grew inside him as the man stared at him before stepping inside without saying a word. Mason felt hesitation deep within. He didn't understand why, but the feeling of worry had overwhelmed his mind. What was this man doing here? Why was he here at this time? No one in his family knew him. Mason hurried into the living room, trying to eavesdrop on the conversation between his mother and the stranger. He can't know about us. Mason heard Thomas's voice coming from the office. If he does, everything will fall apart. The man replied, "You're worrying too much. We'll do everything discreetly, and once we finish the contract, no one can stop us." Mason stood there, his heart pounding. Just this one sentence was enough to make him feel that what he was doing was right. There was definitely something wrong here, but no one believed him. No one but him could see the truth. What were Thomas and the man planning? And would his mother understand what was happening? This feeling made Mason feel incredibly alone. Every time he wanted comfort in his mother's arms, all he received was distance and blind protection. His mother, the one he loved more than anything, was now siding with the man he couldn't trust. These thoughts repeated in Mason's head every night, making him unable to sleep. He felt he no longer had a place in this family. Thomas had changed everything. He could not let this unease continue. The tension had never been so overwhelming in Mason's life. Everything seemed to drag on slowly in the suffocating silence between him and his mother. But when Emma looked into his eyes, he knew that the time had come. His mother had begun to listen, not just listen, but truly acknowledge what he had said. The suffocating feeling seemed to loosen just a little. But Mason knew that this was just the beginning of the great battle he was about to face. Emma sat down, her hands gripping the armrest, her face clouded with indecision. Mason's words were not easy to accept, but they were like a slap in the face, waking her from a deep sleep she hadn't realized she had fallen into. The boy sat beside his mother, his eyes never leaving her, his heart feeling a powerful urge stronger than ever before, urging her not only to hear, but to face the truth. "Mom," Mason said softly but firmly, "I can't let this go on. We need to face the truth. You have to believe me. Thomas is not the man you think he is." Mason struggled to speak, his voice trembling with tension. Emma looked up, but her eyes did not show any worry. She smiled lightly and said, "Sweetie, I've told you already. Thomas is a good man. I trust him." Mason could not let everything continue like this. He couldn't let his mother continue living in confusion and mistake. "You don't understand. Thomas is planning to take all your assets. I've seen it all. I know everything. I have proof." Mason could hardly breathe as he spoke these words. He couldn't imagine what it would be like when his mother heard them. But Mason understood that this was the only thing he could do. Emma looked into his eyes, seemingly trying to understand everything. "Mason, what do you mean? I don't understand. What are you saying that I can't believe?" She shook her head, her eyes seeming worried. But then she turned away as if trying to avoid facing the words Mason had just spoken. But he knew she had started to feel that something was different. A part of her was starting to want to escape the uncertainty she had lived in all this time. "Mom, can't you do something? I can't let you keep living in this deception," Mason said firmly, his eyes scanning her, seeing the anxiety and fear gradually take over her. "I will help you. You have to believe me." Emma looked at her son, her eyes searching for guidance from him. "I understand, Mason. I won't marry Thomas anymore. Mason, I can't." And then, like a wave sweeping away all the emotions inside her, Emma burst into tears. It felt as if all the trust, all the dreams she had built over the years had shattered. The feelings of betrayal, of being deceived, all those emotions flooded her heart. But in that pain, she realized Mason was right. Her son, the only one she could trust, had done everything for her safety and happiness. Mason pulled his mother into his arms, comforting her, soothing her as he did when he was little. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I will be here, and together we will get through it all. Now, with the truth exposed, Mason knew that their lives would never be the same again. But at least he had saved his mother from the schemes Thomas had been laying out. He couldn't predict what would happen next, but one thing he was sure of was that he and his mother would no longer endure these deceptions. Mason looked at his mother, and in her eyes he saw something clear. A new beginning awaited them. And no matter what hardships they faced, they would overcome them together. Mason could no longer sit still for even a minute. He had decided to pursue finding evidence to protect his mother, even though he knew it wouldn't be easy. He understood that if he didn't act right now, Thomas wouldn't just continue gaining his mother's trust, but he would also take away everything she had worked so hard to build. After days of silently observing, Mason finally discovered the contract that Thomas was trying to force his mother to sign. This contract wasn't just a normal financial agreement. It was a massive trap hidden under the guise of love. According to what Mason read, Thomas had been attempting to transfer all of Emma's assets to himself if she agreed to marry him. He couldn't let her sign that contract, because once that happened, everything would be lost. Not only her assets, but also the trust and safety she had built over the years. This contract was the clearest evidence of Thomas's deceit. Mason looked at each page, feeling his heart tighten. Although he couldn't do everything by himself, he knew that if he didn't act immediately, everything would change forever and no one would be able to save them. Mason felt a strange strength rising within him. He couldn't let Emma continue living in lies. Even though he couldn't convince her right at this moment, he had already decided to stop the wedding. This could lead to a major conflict, but Mason knew it was the only decision that could protect his family and his mother's wealth. He couldn't sit idly by and watch his mother be deceived any longer. He began to devise a plan. First, Mason had to find a way to stop Emma and Thomas's wedding before things went too far. He knew he couldn't do this alone, but with the evidence in hand, Mason hoped he could convince his mother and uncover the truth. Mason quietly prepared, not letting any sign of worry show in front of his mother. He had carefully thought through his plan. He knew that if he didn't act right now, Emma would proceed with the wedding without realizing that everything Thomas was doing was just to deceive her. He couldn't let that happen. He decided to find a way to expose the truth, even knowing that the consequences would be huge. At first, Mason thought about speaking directly to his mother, explaining everything he had discovered. But he understood that if he spoke vaguely, Emma wouldn't easily accept it. He needed clear evidence, not only to convince his mother, but also to help her understand that things were not as simple as she thought. "Mom," Mason began, his voice very firm despite a slight tremble. "I found the evidence. I saw the contract that Thomas is trying to make you sign. If you sign it, all your assets will be taken away, and we'll have nothing left." Emma looked at him with a vague expression. She couldn't understand why Mason was saying these things. The boy had never seemed overly worried before, but today his eyes were full of determination, and there was a seriousness in them that she couldn't ignore. But at this moment, she still didn't fully trust what he was saying. "Sweetie, I know you're worried, but I've thought about it a lot. I trust Thomas. He loves me, and you'll understand," Emma said, trying to comfort him, but deep down, she was still worried. Mason couldn't let his mother continue deceiving herself. He decided he had to do whatever it took to make her see the truth. "You can't keep going like this. You have to trust me. Thomas is not the person you think he is. I found the evidence. It's the contract he's using to take everything." He couldn't wait any longer. Mason felt an overwhelming urge. He couldn't let soft words or vague explanations delay the truth anymore. Everything had to stop right now. With everything Mason had uncovered, and with an unshakable determination, He was resolved to do everything he could to stop the wedding. Even though he wasn't sure how Emma would react, he knew one thing. If he didn't act right now, he wouldn't be able to live with himself seeing his mother being deceived any longer. Emma and Thomas's wedding day was drawing near. Everything seemed to be going according to Thomas's plan. Emma joyfully prepared, her face filled with hope and excitement. She couldn't take her eyes off the wedding dresses, the elegant outfits, and even the plans for their honeymoon. It was as though nothing could disrupt the picture of happiness Emma had created in her mind. Everything seemed perfectly arranged, and in Mason's mind, the tension only grew stronger with each passing day. Mason couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't stand by and watch his mother become a part of Thomas's plot. The evidence Mason had gathered felt like disjointed puzzle pieces in the picture he wanted to put together. And every time he thought about the possibility that his mother might face the truth too late, an overwhelming fear surged within him. In the days leading up to the wedding, Mason kept following Thomas, trying to gather more information to make sure his mother wasn't being deceived. He took note of every detail he saw. He even began investigating the people Thomas might be connected to. Then, one late evening, when Emma and Thomas were out preparing for the wedding, Mason made a decision that could no longer be postponed. He couldn't stay still in this house any longer. The feeling of loss and pain was consuming him. He couldn't let things go too far. All the worries and doubts he had carried over the past few days had reached a point where he couldn't bear it any longer. He had to act. He needed to stop this wedding, because if he didn't, Emma would lose everything. Mason walked into the living room, where his mother was preparing documents for the ceremony. In her hands, she held a signed paper, seemingly one of the contracts Thomas had forced her to sign earlier. The suffocating feeling tightened in Mason's chest as he saw his mother engrossed in this, completely unaware that she was standing in the middle of a dangerous plot. He couldn't wait any longer. Mason decided he would tell everything, right now, immediately. He walked up to his mother, his heart feeling like it was about to burst. "Mom, I have to tell you this. You can't marry Thomas. He's not the person you think he is." Mason managed to say, his voice trembling with anxiety. Emma looked up, but her expression showed no sign of worry. She smiled gently and said, "Sweetie, I've already told you. Thomas is a good man. I trust him." Mason couldn't let everything continue like this. He couldn't let his mother continue to live in ambiguity and mistakes. "You don't understand. Thomas is planning to take all of your assets. I've seen everything. I know everything. I have the proof." Mason could hardly breathe as he spoke these words. He couldn't imagine what would happen when his mother heard this. But Mason knew that this was the only thing he could do. Emma looked into his eyes, as if trying to understand everything. "Mason, what do you mean? I don't understand. Why can't I trust what you're saying?" She shook her head, her eyes showing concern, but then she turned away as if wanting to dismiss him. "Don't worry so much. Thomas loves me, and he loves you. I know you're worried about me, but this is something you'll learn when you grow up. I want you to understand that love conquers all." Mason couldn't accept that explanation. The feeling of disappointment and pain surged within him. His mother, the one who had always been there for him over the years, now didn't believe what he was saying. It was unbelievable that his mother was protecting a man whom Mason was certain was deceiving her. The boy became more determined than ever. "You have to trust me. I've seen the contract you signed with Thomas. I've heard everything. Thomas is planning to deceive you. Take all of your assets. You can't live in a world like this. You can't marry a man like him." At this point, Emma could no longer maintain her composure. She stood up abruptly, her eyes wide open. "Mason, you don't understand. You must have misunderstood. It's impossible. Thomas loves me. He loves you. I'm ready to marry him because he's the only one who makes me feel like I can love again. Emma almost shouted, her voice beginning to shake. Mason didn't stop. He moved closer to his mother, looked directly into her eyes, and said, "Mom, I love you, but you're being deceived. You can't marry him. You can't let everything we have, everything you've built, be taken away. If you go through with this marriage, we will lose everything. You will lose everything, and I can't let that happen." A moment of silence passed. Emma stood there, her hands shaking. It felt like she didn't know what to do or what to say. She looked into Mason's eyes, and slowly, her gaze began to change. It was no longer the certainty she once had when looking at Thomas. She began to reconsider everything in her life, from the love she had for Thomas to the important decisions she had made. After a few seconds, Emma finally spoke, but her voice was no longer sharp, but soft, full of hesitation. "Mason, I don't know what to do, but you are my son, and I love you more than anything. I'll think about everything you've said." Mason's words had shaken Emma. The two of them stood there in silence, the tension surrounding them. Suddenly, Mason felt a slight relief when he saw that his mother had finally opened up and realized something was wrong. He knew that he had done the right thing, even though it might have been a difficult and painful step. The tension had never reached such a peak in Mason's life. Everything seemed to pass slowly in the suffocating silence between him and his mother. But when Emma looked into his eyes, Mason knew the time had come. His mother had begun to listen, not just hear, but truly acknowledge what he had said. The suffocating feeling eased slightly, but Mason knew this was just the beginning of the great battle that awaited him. Emma sat down, her hand gripping the armrest tightly, her face clouded with indecision. Mason's words were not easy for her to accept, but they felt like a sharp slap, waking her from a deep sleep she hadn't realized she had fallen into. The boy sat beside his mother, his eyes fixed on her, feeling an overwhelming urge stronger than ever, urging her not just to hear, but to face the truth. "Mom," Mason said quietly but firmly, "I can't let this go on. We need to face the truth. You have to trust me. Thomas is not who you think he is. He has a plan that I can't let you fall into." He paused for a moment, seeing Emma tilt her head slightly, her eyes no longer glowing with blind trust, but with worry and fear. He continued, his voice trembling but resolute. "I've been following him. I've seen everything. He's lying to you, to me. He just wants to take your wealth. And not only that, he's using you as a pawn in his game." Emma fell silent for a few seconds. She didn't speak, but Mason could sense a change in her gaze. It was doubt, a little anxiety, and also a deep inner conflict in the heart of the mother he had always loved. He looked at her face, and then something in him compelled him to speak out. "He made you sign a contract, don't you realize? Thomas didn't come just to be a friend, but to take everything you have." Mason said, his agitation apparent. Every word that left his mouth felt like fire burning within him. He could no longer bear it. Everything, the secrets he had uncovered, was now ready to be exposed. Emma stood up, her hands clenched, her face suddenly tense. "No way, this can't be true." She turned away, her eyes distant, as if trying to find a reason not to face the words Mason had spoken. But Mason knew that she had started to feel something different. A part of her was wanting to break free from the ambiguity she had been living in all this time. "Mom, you have to face this," Mason said urgently. "I've been following Thomas. You can't live in this lie anymore. I can't let you fall into that trap." He stood up, walking closer to her. "You signed that contract with him, right? This is what he needs to take everything. You have to read that contract again. You'll see that what I'm saying is true." Emma didn't speak, only looked down at the ground, where the signed contract had once been. It felt like all her thoughts were erupting in that moment. After a long while, she looked back at Mason, her face full of exhaustion and weariness. "How do you know all this?" Emma asked, her voice suddenly weak, as if part of her had begun to accept the truth. "How can you be sure that what you're saying is right?" "I've seen the contract, Mom. I've seen everything Thomas hid from you." Mason looked directly into her eyes. "He's been planning this for a long time, and you're his target." Emma sat down, her eyes closing for a moment, her head lowered as if trying to digest what Mason had just said. It felt like time had stopped. Everything around them became eerily still, only the sound of Emma's breathing, as if she were struggling with the truth Mason had just revealed. After a while, Emma stood up, looking at her son, no longer with the protective stance she had always shown when looking at Thomas. She took a sheet of paper from the drawer of the desk, unfolded it, and looked at the contract that Mason had uncovered earlier. Under the dim light of the lamp, she slowly skimmed through the terms. It was as though Mason's words had begun to sink deeply into her mind. "Mom, can't you do anything? I can't let you continue living this lie," Mason said firmly, his eyes scanning her, seeing the anxiety and fear slowly enveloping her. "I'll help you. You have to trust me." Emma looked at her son, her gaze filled with confusion, worry, and also sorrow. "I don't know what to do, but I won't marry him anymore, Mason. I can't." And then, like a wave that swept away all emotions within her, Emma broke down in tears. It felt like all the trust, all the dreams she had built over the years were now shattered. The feeling of betrayal, of being deceived, overwhelmed her. But in that pain, she realized that Mason was right. Her son, the only one she could trust, had done everything for her safety and happiness. Mason pulled her into his arms, comforting her, soothing her like when she was a child. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'll be here, and together we'll get through everything." Now that the truth had been revealed, Mason knew that their lives would never be the same again. But at least, he had been able to save his mother from the traps Thomas had set. He couldn't predict what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He and his mother would no longer endure these deceptions. After everything unraveled, and after Mason tirelessly fought for the truth, Emma stood facing her son, her eyes filled with tears, harboring deep disappointment. She couldn't believe what she had done, couldn't accept that she had been wrong, that she had fallen into the arms of a man who wasn't worthy. She felt ashamed, embarrassed for not having listened to her son. Mason had warned her countless times, but Emma had been too caught up in Thomas's sweet words. The pain in her heart only deepened when she realized that the only person she could truly trust and rely on was Mason. Even though she had hurt him, she now understood that he was the only one who had always stood by her side, protecting her from Thomas's deceit. Mason not only protected her wealth, but also protected the love within their family, safeguarding the values that had made her the strong woman she was, always striving to give her son a better life. And now, when facing the truth, Emma realized that all the luxuries and fleeting things in life, like the love she thought she had found with Thomas, were all illusions. The only things that truly mattered were love and honesty within a family. And that's what Mason had taught her. Though her son was still young, he was the most resilient in any situation. In the days that followed, Emma and Mason had to confront many different emotions, from embarrassment and regret to the pain of not trusting her son sooner. Those nights Emma spent alone, reflecting on her wrong decisions, constantly blaming herself for not seeing Thomas's true nature. She had spent too much time dreaming of a perfect future, a family where Mason could have a father, and where she could find joy and love again. But now, everything was shattered. She understood that while love might bring joy, it was family love and honesty that were necessary to build a stable life. Mason never blamed his mother for her past decisions. He wasn't angry or hurt by being overlooked. Instead, he poured all his love into her and was ready to help her through these difficulties. He knew their family would never be the same again, but he also knew that with unity and love, they would overcome everything. Mason was the first to realize that in life, values like honesty, love, and protecting family should always come first. Not only did he help his mother realize this, but he also taught her how to face the truth she didn't want to acknowledge. It was a long, challenging process, but the young boy never stopped persevering. Each time Emma felt discouraged, each time she felt exhausted and didn't know what to do, Mason was there to comfort her, encourage her, and remind her that the truth would always come to light and help them overcome any challenge. And then, when Emma decided not to marry Thomas anymore, she knew it was a crucial turning point in her life. She felt that part of her had been freed, and the worries and nightmares about Thomas no longer haunted her. She began to find peace within herself, and that peace came thanks to Mason's resilience and courage. The boy had proven that, no matter the circumstances, family was always the most important choice. Mason and Emma began rebuilding their lives. They no longer looked back at the past with regret, but focused on the future instead. Emma decided to reopen the coffee shop she had always dreamed of, and Mason began pursuing his own passions. The boy decided to follow his dreams of learning and exploring what he loved, gradually growing more mature. The mother and son now became the best companions, facing all the challenges life threw their way together. Although they no longer lived under the protection of a man like Thomas, Mason and Emma understood they could create a better life together. They didn't need to rely on anyone else but themselves. Mason had protected the family, shielded his mother from the schemes and deceit, and through that process, he had helped her realize that family and love were invaluable values they needed to preserve. In the days that followed, Mason and Emma's lives returned to peace. They no longer had to live in fear of deceit, no longer had to fear threats from unworthy people. Their relationship became stronger and more resilient. Emma learned to trust Mason, and the boy understood that no matter the hardships his mother might face in the future, as long as they stood together, nothing was impossible. And finally, when summer arrived, Mason and Emma decided to take a small vacation, just the two of them. They spent time together, exploring new places, new spaces, and more importantly, enjoying the peace they had reclaimed. Mason smiled as he watched his mother smile, her face no longer marked by worry or sadness. Emma had changed, not just externally, but from within. The feeling of being loved, trusted, and protected had helped her become a stronger woman than ever before. They didn't need men like Thomas to complete their lives. They had each other, and that was all they needed. Mason felt the change in his family, felt at peace, and believed that no matter how life stumbled, family would always be the most solid foundation. For Mason, everything started with family love, with honesty, and the courage to stand up and protect those he loved. With these values, Mason and Emma would begin again, not just a new life, but a truly meaningful one. The story of Mason and Emma is an emotional journey, vividly portraying the challenges that every family might face in life. Through tense situations and conflicts, the story imparts profound lessons about the value of family, love, honesty, and the courage to face the truth. This is not merely a battle between good and evil, but a lesson about maturity, forgiveness, and rebuilding life after setbacks. When Emma lost trust in her son, Mason was the only one who stood up to protect the family from the deceit and scheming of Thomas. Although Emma had been blinded by Thomas's sweet words and promises, in the end, it was Mason's love and resilience that helped her realize that family was the most important thing. This story reminds us that in any circumstance, family is where we can find support and protection. And the love within a family is the foundation that helps us overcome any difficulty. Thomas deceived Emma, but Mason never stopped expressing the truth. Mason's warnings weren't just the words of a child. They were the courage of a son wanting to protect his mother. Even though Emma rejected him and didn't trust him, Mason remained steadfast in defending the truth. Honesty, though it might hurt, is the most important element in building trust and love within a family. This story is a lesson about never compromising with the truth, no matter how difficult it may be. Mason never gave up his faith in himself and in the rightness of what he was saying. He persisted in protecting his mother, even though she didn't trust him first. This story reminds us that, in life, even when we are doubted or misunderstood, we should never give up on our belief in ourselves. Sometimes, our belief in ourselves will help uncover the truth and protect the important values in life. Although Emma was wrong for not trusting her son at first, she eventually recognized her mistake and found a way to correct it. Mason never blamed his mother, but always gave her forgiveness and helped her realize that mistakes are an inseparable part of life, and correcting them is an essential step in the process of growing. Forgiveness is not only a beautiful act, but also a way to resolve conflicts and help us move forward. Only by learning to forgive can we find peace within our souls. Mason never stopped confronting the truth, even knowing that his mother would not easily accept it. But it was his courage that helped him resolve all the conflicts within and made Emma realize the deceit. This story teaches us that, although facing the truth may be painful, it is the only way for us not to live in fear and uncertainty. The truth will set us free from burdens and help us build a new life. Emma had to face disappointment and pain when she realized that she had been wrong in trusting Thomas. However, after stopping to reflect carefully, she realized that family love and honesty were the most valuable things. Sometimes, life can make us lose direction, but only when we pause and reflect can we truly see the things that are truly important in life. After the truth was revealed and Thomas was removed from their lives, Mason and Emma began anew. Despite the pain and the wounds of the past, they could still build a new life, a fresh start. This story teaches us that nothing is impossible to change, and no matter how harsh life may be, we always have the opportunity to change and start over, as long as we have enough determination and love. Emma regained strength and confidence when she realized that she was not alone in life. Mason had stood by her side, protecting her through all hardships. This story reminds us that love and unity within a family can help us overcome any challenges. Every time we face difficulties, the support from family and loved ones is an incredibly valuable source of strength, making us stronger and more resilient. When Thomas left their lives, Mason and Emma found real safety again. They no longer had to worry about deceit or schemes. The genuine love within their family brought them peace and belief in a bright future. This story is a reminder that sincere relationships, where there is trust and love, are the most solid foundation that helps us feel safe and happy. The story of Mason and Emma is not just a family story, but also a long journey of maturity, honesty, and sacrifice. Each lesson in the story gives the reader a deep perspective on the important values in life. From family love to honesty, this story affirms that no matter the circumstances, honesty, love, and unity are the elements that help us overcome difficulties and build a meaningful life.